Good evening, everybody. I hope my sound is okay. I know music quite quiet. I've decided to carry on with the Seventh Arcanum, following on from yesterday's reading from Nina Roudnikova's book, The Solar Way. The Seventh Arcanum, they're all important, but there's something particularly pivotal about the Seventh Arcanum and the magical number 7, whose space it occupies. So I'm going to do a bit of a mix-up here of two more tarot teachers, beginning with Valentin Tomberg, author of Meditations on the Tarot, of course. I'm not going to attempt to read all of his teachings on the Chariot, which is vast, and he actually acknowledges himself that this arcanum in its own right could be a whole book. But I opened this arcanum and I decided to read you the first bit which jumped out, which would seem to me the message most appropriate to convey. So, here's what Valentin Tomberg has to say here at this point. One speaks often of the dangers of occultism. Black magic is usually the supreme danger against which the beginner is put on guard by the masters, whilst others, above all those who know more or less about medicine, see it as disorders of the nervous system. But experience during 43 years of practical occultism or esotericism has taught me that the danger of occultism is neither black magic nor nervous disorder. At least, these dangers are met no more often amongst occultists than amongst politicians, artists, psychologists, believers and agnostics. I am not able to cite by name any black magician amongst the occultists that I know, whereas it would not be too difficult to name some politicians who, for example, have nothing to do with occultism and who would even be hostile to it, but whose influence and impact agree very well with the classical concept of that of the black magician. Indeed, it is difficult to name politicians who have exercised a deadly suggestive influence on the popular masses, blinding them and inciting them to acts of cruelty, injustice and violence, of which each individual taken separately would be incapable, and who, through their semi-magical influence, have deprived individuals of their freedom and rendered them possessed. And is not this action to deprive men of their moral freedom and to render them possessed the aim and very essence of black magic? No, dear unknown friend, occultists, including those amongst them who practice ceremonial magic, are neither masters nor disciples of black magic. Truth to tell, they are amongst those who have least of all in common with it. It is true that they, above all the adepts of ceremonial magic, often fall prey to illusions and mislead themselves and others. But is this black magic? He would say no. So I've skipped a little bit. And then he says, no, neither black magic nor nervous disorders constitute the special dangers of occultism. Its principal danger, of which, however, it has no monopoly, is designated by the 3 terms: superiority complex, inflation, and megalomania. In fact, an occultist who is not a beginner, who has not attained this moral illness, or who has not at some time in the past undergone it, is rare. The tendency to megalomania shows up all over the place amongst occultists. Decades of personal relationships, as well as reading occult literature, have taught me this. Very observant as usual, extremely perceptive, and very, very pertinent to each arcanum has its shadow side and the potential for falling into megalomaniac tendencies rather than a holy divine victory is the danger most associated with the Chariot. Arcanum 7, which has a picture which kind of shows why. This is from the Art Theurg Tarot. Those are 2 sphinxes. Okay, so bearing that in mind always, in any occult studies, where should I put this? I'm now going to move on to the next great big tarot book, Holy Book of Thoth. And I'm not going to read it all because it's so dense it becomes exhausting. But Arcanum 7, traditional names: Spiritus Dominat Formam, Victoria, Jus Propnetatis, Curriculum Emetis, the Chariot of Hermes, Hebrew letter Zayin, numerical designation 7. I won't read out all the symbolic content of the card image, but I'll show you one of the images that was used by Shmakov's group at that time, by the artist Mastyutin, the Russian artist. Now he begins with a typically extremely weighty subject about the great fall of the universal man. And he gives an ancient prayer. O thou one, self-manifest, manifest thyself in me. The first turn of the arcana, which would be magician, high priestess, empress, is the doctrine of the universal homogeneous spirit, of its being, consciousness, and life in its pure nature. Arcana 4, 5, and 6 affirm the potential existence of the monads, its individual aspects. By asserting the creation of the whole, the monads thereby reveal the principle of the particular, for these representations are inextricably linked and mutually affirm each other. Thus, the cycle of the first 6 arcana is a complete cosmogony, a closed and complete teaching, hexagram, the seal of Solomon. Divine creativity, which lies entirely in the realm of the spirit, is confirmed and ends with the revelation of the host of Atman. The further era of the world cosmogony is the affirmation of each of the Atmans in itself. It is the creation of particulars and the generation of the principles of the phenomenal world. The deity as a whole departs from creativity, for the latter is already carried out by the totality of the Atman, and it does not matter whether we consider each Atman as a self-sufficient substance, or whether we understand it as an aspect of the deity. In either case, equally, the source of each further manifestation will be a single Atman. Indeed, in the one case he will be a deity as such, in the other he will, generally speaking, be its vehicle. But for the consciousness of the man of the world being, the distinction between these and other manifestations eludes. In this way we have come to the Septerna doctrine, that with the identification of the final lowest member, the first turner departs, as such, says about the one which has now become ignorabimus. And then there's a quote from Genesis. And God finished on the 7th day all his work that he had done, and rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. And God blessed the 7th day, and sanctified it, for in it he rested from all his works that God had done and made. The cosmic created self-consciousness of the deity is the universal humanity, the potential Adam Kadmon. In this aspect, The arcana of the second turner are the teachings on the fundamental principles of the existence of universal humanity and its connection with the universal spirit. So the arcana of the second turner are the Emperor, the Pope and the Lovers. In Arcanum 4, the Emperor, the deity is recognised as the universal world synthesis of the being, life and activity of all the individual parts of universal humanity. Arcanum 5, the Pope, like Arcanum 2, the High Priestess, speaks of the inner consciousness of both the integral universal humanity and its individual members. Arcanum 6, the Lovers, like Arcanum 3, the Empress, speaks of the life of both universal humanity and its individual members. In Arcanum 3, we studied the birth of the archetype as an independent reality through the emanation of the divine cosmic consciousness beyond its uncreated unity. The original image loses its connection with similar ones as soon as it begins to be aware of itself and its individual consciousness, begins to reveal and assert its own properties and qualities. Each monad is a prototype of its inherent potential relative world. Being born in Arcanum 4, the primordial image is simultaneously born in Arcanum 5 and 6. But this primordial birth leads only to the potential possibility of being, because this monad is still unapproved. Still an unapproved primordial image. In other words, in relation to itself, it is still a purely abstract concept. The affirmation of the primordial image is the transformation of itself as such into reality, but at the same time there is a break with the world inherent in its pure nature. There is its fall. Thus the birth of the archetype is both its fall and its break with the whole. Arcanum 7 is the doctrine of the affirmation of a single monad, and therefore the birth of this arcanum is the fall of the monad as the archetype, the fall of the entire cosmic totality of monads, the break of the universal Adam Kadmon with the one deity, and the fall of the primordial Logos, Lucifer, as the supreme principle, affirming the existence of universal humanity, the created cosmic spirit. There's a quote then from Eliphas Levi. "O Lucifer, you fall in order to rise. You taste death in order to know life better." Instead of living happily in the mother substance of the divine nature and in the unity of the Word, Adam, impelled by egoism, wishes to know and understand nature in itself, in its root essence, before the divine kiss that gives birth to being, which Burma calls its dark root, in a word, wished to know it in its womb before fertilization. That instantly puts me in mind of a quote that is given in the Mailander teachings, recently brought out by Sam Robinson, where part of a prayer mantra, which I found to be really wonderful, is "The Holy Spirit must birth it, I cannot will it." To possess this occult entity before its luminous conception, the pinnacle of possible life that does not yet exist, but wants to exist, this is the vague intention of Adam Eloi. He passionately plunges into delusion, seeking in it light, autonomous life and omnipotence, but finds only a suggestive darkness, like of Moses, enveloping in accordance with Hellenic esotericism. The great night of Orpheus, the mother night, the mother of Prothea, the great goddess, before she, impregnated by a great being, gave birth to Primigon, the universal Logos, from which all the gods will come out in pairs, if you see the hymn of Orpheus, like this, syzygy. The darkness, thirsty and eternally deceived in its expectations, finds incomparable torment and great effort. It is swallowed up by this non-existence that strives for existence, which sucks out his life and becomes an incessantly devouring lava for him. This darkness of primordial boundaries, primeval, where the invisible light of the pure spirit originates and is reflected in it, is filled with three potential forces united in the physiogenetic apex, namely the compressive force, the originator of density, the expanding force, the originator of sparsity, and finally the force of rotation, the product of the struggle of these two first, the mother of the fire principle. This triple dynamism, the occult foundation of all created life, takes possession of Adam, Eve, and thus the expanding force, stretching the substance of Adam, gives birth to Abel, the etheric space, a centrifugal force, and the compressing force gives Cain, the time divider, a centripetal force. For when Adam becomes changeable, he knows time, and when he becomes corporeal, he knows space. Time condenses the etheric substance of space into nebulous clusters. Cain kills Abel, and from here comes the material world, which is organised at the dawn of the third property of the abyss, the force of rotation, which gives rise to Seth, the stellar distribution of the Adamic substance in space with the help of time. That mind-boggling quote was from Stanislas de Guaita, the Clef de la Magie Noire. Whoa. Great correspondences between Stanislas de Guaita and Shmakov. Kindred spirits, they even looked like each other. Now we have another quote. Shmakov loves his quotes, as readers will have realised. This is from Eckharthausen. The secret teaching of all the allegorical mysteries of antiquity taught men that man, through sensuality, fell from the degree of contemplation on which he stood, and that only through the return procession can he acquire the light of his perfection. Now from the Zohar. Before he sinned, Adam perceived only the wisdom whose light falls from above. He was not yet separated from the tree of life. But when he yielded to the desire to know the things of the lowlands and descend into their midst, he was seduced. He knew evil and forgot good. He was separated from the tree of life. Before they did this, they heard the voice above. They perceived the higher wisdom. They retained their exalted and luminous nature. But after the fall, they found it difficult even to understand the voices of the lowlands. And from Asclepius. Why was it necessary, O Trismegistus, that man should ascend into the world, instead of enjoying the beauty of the supreme and the divine part of his being? Hermes answers, Your question is natural, O Asclepius. I ask God to help me answer it, for everything depends on his will, especially the high subject that is currently the object of our research. Listen to me, Asclepius. The Most High and Creator of all things, whom we call God, created the second God, Arcanum 22, the world, Shmakov says, visible and felt. I call him so, not because he feels himself, for now is not the time to examine this question, but because he is palpable by our senses. And so, having created this one being, which occupies the first place among the creatures and the second after heaven, he found that he was good and filled him with all kinds of good and loved him as his own child. And he then wished that someone else could contemplate this being so great and so perfect, which he revealed from himself. And therefore he created a man, gifted with reason and wisdom. The desire of God is absolute fulfillment. To desire and fulfill for him is a simultaneous act. and since he knew that an entity could not know all things without being surrounded by the world, he gave it a body to live in. He wanted her to have two natures, and that she would continuously unite them and unite them in harmony. And then back to Stanislas de Guaita, the same book, Le Clef de la Magie Noire. Let us not miss the opportunity to say once again that Elohim created everything only in principle, in the archetype. The Edenic mission of the universal man was to be able to exteriorize beings, forcing them to move from the ideal principle to the actual essence, and from the essence to the sensuous manifestation by the magic of their will alone. Therefore Adam was the true creator, in the sense in which the word is understood, for he created beings in the outside, made them manifest, extracting them from the occult principle, inner and hidden. But Adam himself fell into the fetters of his creation, and, subdividing himself in turn, he clothed himself with matter like his works. This fall of Adam Kadmon is the birth of phenomenal nature, phenomenal life, and phenomenal figures. Back to Eckharthausen's Night's All Conversations of a Wise Man with a Friend. Man had a higher purpose. Spiritual goods were created for him, not sensual ones, but he did not want to enjoy them, and so the spirit could not enjoy them, having misused its knowledge. He knew the relations of the intelligent with the sensual, and this knowledge he directed to the enjoyment of the sensual. Then he was covered with animal skin, felt his nakedness, and could no longer soar, because sensuality had put chains on him. The Zohar again. When Adam, our first father, lived in the Garden of Eden, he was dressed, as it is in heaven, in a garment woven from the supreme light. When he was cast out of the Garden of Eden and had to adapt to the needs of this world, what happened then? God, we are told by the scriptures, made Adam and his wife garments of leather, which they put on, for before they had garments of the light of the Supreme, which they use in Eden. By leather, I think we mean in skins. These new garments of Adam Eve are the essence of man's being, his body in a world of phenomenal rough likeness to the realm of pure spirit. And of course, purification of the body and bringing holiness into the body is the pietistic work. We'll remember here what Tomberg says about the body, perhaps somewhat different to what we're seeing here, that the body is not inherently sinful. The poor body is really punished by the soul of mankind, that which sinned. The body itself is not sinful. Not the vehicle of our sin, not the. It's not its fault. And from Isaac Luria, then he was so huge that his camp extended in 3 worlds, creative, education and action, and that then he was brought into himself through the separation of his members, as it is said there, so it became necessary for him to have another body made of skin and meat. This refers to the material body that he received in this world, as it is written in Genesis chapter 3 verse 22, and God made them leather garments. By leather clothing we must understand the gross body that we have after the fall. From the Gemara, which is part of the Talmud. If our first parents had not sinned, we would not have come into this world. Shmakov says, this is the true esoteric meaning of the great fall of the universal man. So, I think there's an awful lot there to digest, and I've only read 4 pages. I don't want to go too much into the next section because again this is going to be enormous, but the second part of his teaching of the Seventh Arcanum, the Chariot, is on what he calls the Laya Centre or the Doctrine. Now, this was very challenging to attempt to translate at all, because whilst there are definitions for the Laya Centre in Theosophy, the Doctrine was secret to Shmakov's circle. And it's only by talking to modern day practitioners in Russia who understand this teaching better than I do and have more links to the chain that I was able to even get an inkling of what he means here. But the Laya Centre or the Doctrine, so if we try to understand the Laya Centre, and I've put this in my own notes, sometimes spelt Layu, this is a theosophical phrase which refers to the point of matter where every differentiation has ceased. It comes from a Sanskrit word laya, meaning extinction, dissolution or rest. Pralaya? According to Blavatsky, whatsoever quits the laya, homogeneous state, becomes active conscious life. Individual consciousness emanates from and returns into absolute consciousness, which is eternal motion. Laya Centre, a point of disappearance, which is the Sanskrit meaning, means to dissolve, to disintegrate, or to vanish away. The Laya Centre, the mystical point where a thing disappears from one plane and passes onwards to reappear on another. It is that point or spot, any point or spot in space, which, owing to karmic law, suddenly becomes the centre of active life, first on a higher plane and later descending into manifestation through and by the Laya centres of the lower planes. In one sense, the Laya Centre may be conceived of as a canal, a channel, through which the vitality of the superior spheres pours down into and inspires, inbreathes into the lower planes or states of matter, or rather of substance. But behind this vitality, there is a directive and driving force. There are mechanics in the universe, mechanics of any degrees of consciousness and power, but behind the pure mechanic stands the spiritual intellectual mechanic. Finally, a Laya Centre is the point where substance becomes homogeneous. Any Laya Centre, therefore, of necessity exists in and on the critical line or stage dividing one plane from another. Any hierarchy, therefore, contains within itself a number of Laya centres. Don't want to read too much from Helena Blavatsky, but this is useful from the Secret Doctrine. The swift and radiant one produces the 7 Laya centres against which none will prevail to the great day. Be with us, and seats the universe on these eternal foundations. Again, the 7. Now, Iya, this is what I wrote. We've puzzled over it. what they meant. I really puzzled over what he meant by Iya. You know, although he's saying himself it corresponds to the Laya Centre. There's a Sumerian deity, Ea, which corresponds to Enki. She uses one of the manifestations of God in the legends of the Templars. Okay, back to Shmakov. Like I said, I won't read too much of this. About the man of the world of being, about his 7 worlds and their consciousnesses. So now there's a reading from G. Oldenburg's book, Buddha, His Life and Teachings. The 10th breath is given to man. The Atman is the 11th, and all the breathing powers are based on it. In the middle is placed the Atman. Around it the breathing forces. Just as all the spokes are connected in the hub and jam of the wheel, so are all the breathing forces, all the worlds, all the gods, all the beings, all these eyes connected in this Atman, the Brahman of 100 paths. From the Katha Upanishad. Know me as the master of the chariot, and the body as the chariot. A person knows himself and the world around him according to the data of his experience, because if he were deprived of the opportunity to manifest his activity, he could not reach either self-knowledge or consciousness of the reality surrounding him. Whoever wants, says Rickert, to know the value practically must experience it. A person draws his experience from all sides of his being, but all these perceptions invariably result in a certain form, conditioned by the general type of consciousness. The incarnate man always builds every concept, every thought, on the foundations of the physical world. Thought as such differs from the thought of a real volume, only in that in one case a person can be convinced directly by physical feelings of its existence, while in another he is deprived of it. But in both cases equally, a person builds the whole course of his thinking on the laws and properties of the physical world. The most abstract mathematical thought always proceeds either from a geometrical concrete representation or from an abstract concept of magnitude, but it is quite obvious that the very concept of magnitude is an internal category of the physical world. No matter how far an incarnate person may depart from the physical world, he still thinks in the world of forms, sounds, time and light. No matter how much a person tries to imagine a spiritual being, he can think of nothing but the idealization of human properties. There's a quote here from Sadi, the Fruit Garden, Sadi being a Persian philosopher who's quoted quite frequently by Shmakov. No matter how winged our thoughts are, they will never leave the ground. The statement follows from the above. The incarnate person lives, feels and thinks exclusively by the phenomena of the physical world. All kinds of human cognition exist only insofar as they lead to the self-perception of man, and therefore consciousness is the totality of feelings and cognitions. The difference of feelings and cognitions entails a difference of consciousness, and vice versa. Hence it becomes clear that each world, divided by the totality of certain kinds of cognitions, asserts and is itself confirmed by the existence of the corresponding consciousness. The plane, that is, the random, generally speaking, cross-section of the cosmos in metaphysical space, is confirmed in being by the attributes inherent in the phenomena that manifest themselves in this plane. Hence it is clear that the differences of planes results from the difference of phenomenal attributes, and moreover, generally speaking, but not in the order of synthesis, but only by virtue of personal isolation. On the contrary, the difference between the worlds, which confirms the difference between the consciousnesses, arises from a deep difference in their very essence. All this is expressed by the law. The planes are coordinated by phenomena. The worlds are coordinated by consciousnesses. The Atman of man is the true and absolute likeness of the universal spirit, just as the deity is one for the macrocosm. So the Atman is one and all-encompassing for the world of the microcosm in the same absolute way. The deity and the Atman, all consubstantial in nature, analogous to each other, single in essence, all-encompassing in principle, and different from each other, only in that the infinity of the deity is a degree higher than the infinity of the Atman. Everything that lies below the perfect man is deprived of the possibility in principle of perceiving the absolute in its true nature, because in his consciousness they cannot be separated. again from Stanislas de Guaita. Jehovah, we read in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, formed the entire animal kingdom of earthly nature and all the flying genera of the heavens outside of the Adamic element, that is, the homogeneous element from which the substance of Adam flows. But Jehovah created animals only in principles, and man had to translate them from the possibilities of being into being. Arcanum 7. Is the doctrine of man in the highest and absolute sense of the word. The Atman carries out the creation of its own relative world in general, but absolute for a given person. The individual world by exact analogy with the creation of the universe. In Arcanum 6, the monad is known in the state of a fully revealed substance of the second kind, objectified and delimited among other similar ones. It occupies a very definite place in the whole universe as a concrete set of the tonalities of the spirit. At the same time, it does not possess the gift of self-consciousness, does not feel its being, and does not even live, being only an abstract possibility of reality, but not reality itself. Arcanum 7 teaches about a great turning point in the existence of the cosmic family of monads. Each of them decides to leave the bright region of the spirit, inherent in its true nature, and at the cost of this sacrifice to transform itself into reality, to know itself and to know its place as a whole. The spirit cannot lose its nature, even if it wills it to do so. As a single reality, it can neither find a successor nor bind its essence with fetters. Having decided to delve into the waves of illusion, to ascend into his specific potencies, he only breaks his consciousness with the essence of his being and emanates it into the sphere of his potential possibilities. From this moment, the consciousness begins to feel the beginning of its being outside and above itself. It clearly begins to feel the illusory nature of its states, and at the same time is filled with a thirst for reality, tends to the spiritual essence of the entire human being. And once again, a reminder of the Mailander teaching, which was brought up from yesterday's reading of the 7th Arcanum. Okay. Purity is innocence. Only one who can sacrifice himself lives in purity. Purity is innocence. Only one who can sacrifice himself lives in purity. This moment of the fall, this is the time to remember purity and innocence. Okay? Moment of the fall. Each of the family of the monads decides to leave the bright region of the spirit, inherent in its true nature, and at the cost of this sacrifice, to transform itself into reality, to know itself and to know its place as a whole. The spirit cannot lose its nature. Even if it wills it to do so, as a single reality, it can neither find a successor nor bind its essence with fetters. Only one who can sacrifice himself lives in purity. I've got a reading now from a quote from Sri Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya. I'm sure I'm Shankaracharya. Thanks to him who has the form of eternal consciousness, all things are known, from the akankara down to the body, lust, etc., as vessels of the spirit which exists by itself and without a vessel. This spirit of Purusha, the being, the Atman, the essence of all things, is the eternal, permanent, unconditional, absolute bliss, which is constantly equal to itself and is self-consciousness, the verb, word, logos, whose spirit of life is set in motion. And from Meister Eckhart, Sermons and Discourses, this is what one pagan sage said to another in a beautiful word. I feel something in me that shines in my mind. I fully feel that it is something, and what it is, I cannot comprehend, but it seems to me that if I understood it, I would know the whole truth. The monad as a primordial image objectifies the whole being of man in the metaphysical expanse by the totality of its potential properties and qualities, as an exhaustive body of the spirit, its phenomenal counterpart. This being is nothing but a system of possibilities of the Atman. It is born together with it and exists abstractly, being transformed into reality only by the work of dynamic consciousness. When the monad, striving for self-knowledge and affirmation, emanates its consciousness outside of its one essence, this latter begins to slide along the lines of analogy, descending involutively to the simplest concrete potencies. At the same time, there is a process of gradual rebirth of consciousness and the identification of the principles of the involutional septerna from the Atman. The revealed and confirmed monad is the system of the Atman and its integral being, as the body of the spirit, mutually confirmed and dissolved in each other. All the abstract potencies that previously lay outside the essence of the Atman enter into it, become, as it were, facets of his self-consciousness, through which, on the one hand, he feels his individuality, and on the other communicates with the entire world what lies outside of him. In harmony with this, the Atman seems to enter into all the qualities of its being, penetrates into all the types and forms of its tonalities, reflects in them like a ray of light, and connects all their diversity into one whole. This idea is expressed by tradition in the formula: the human spirit is the ray of the deity that permeates matter. And again from Sri Shankaracharya: the Atman is that which penetrates the whole world, but does not penetrate it. That which illuminates all things, but all things cannot illuminate it. Okay, last section, and then I'll stop. Descending in the order of synthesis from the Atman to the concrete differential potencies, consciousness gradually changes its nature in its very being. This successive change is sharply divided into 7 separate sections, each of which, according to the above law, causes the corresponding world to be, and, in turn, it is confirmed in reality. Remember those Laya Centres, through which it's concentrated and descends? Through the involutional descent, the integral consciousness of man is gradually delayed by all the worlds of the cosmos, each of which, like a metaphysical network, delays those parts of it that correspond to it. As a result of this process, the consciousness of the whole human being is divided into 7 separate belts. Chakras, of course. Each of which begins to live as an independent whole in its own world. The separation of the whole consciousness entails the illusion of the dissection of the individual spirit. Each type of consciousness objectifies in the Atman its inherent aspect, which becomes an absolute beginning in relation to this world. These principles I will call Iya. Elena Blavatsky in her Secret Doctrine assigns them the name of Laya Centres. The doctrine of the Iya or Laya Centres is the cornerstone of all esoteric teaching about man. Being of such grandiose importance, it is at the same time very difficult for our minds to assimilate. For ease of understanding, I can give following examples from the fields of physics. The beam of light passes successfully through a series of semi-transparent concave mirrors placed one after the other. Each of these mirrors will produce an image of a glowing dot. Mirrors are the He of different worlds. He as in Yod, He, Vav, the tetragrammaton. He, the Hebrew letter, the 5th letter. Mirrors are the He of different worlds. A ray of light is the ray of Atman. Individual images are the Iya of different worlds. Obeying the law of analogy, each individual Iya, like the Atman itself and the deity as a whole, knows itself in its reflection. Each Iya is a cross-section of the Atman, and therefore the Atman knows itself in its cross-sections through its own manifestations. Again from Sri Shankaracharya. The one who knows everything through himself, but whom no one sees, the one who animates the buddhi and others, but is not animated by them, is the Atman himself. The human being as a whole consists of a series of separate souls arranged according to two general laws. First, each higher soul is projected onto the lower ones and vice versa. In itself it is a complex of the soul of this plane, as such, plus projections of the souls of the higher planes. Second, each soul having in its plane its own cross-section of the ray of the divine essence is thus a complete and vital being, able to enter independently of the souls of other planes into relationships in this plane with other similar souls. He has a quote now from Cornelius Agrippa, The Occult Philosophy. Each higher power sends its rays in a long continuous series to all the lower ones agreed with it, and on the other hand, the lower can reach the higher by passing through all the individual stages. The lower is so connected with the higher that its influence extends to the extreme points of the row, just as a string swings all the way through if you touch only the end of it. Actually, I'm getting there. Getting there. The ray emanating from the divine essence is polarized for each individual into the ray of the world of the upland and the ray of the world of being. The second reveals individual souls spiritualized by another ray. The first performs this spiritualization and, at the same time, is, as it were, a channel through which the macrocosmic consciousness of the divine soul pours out its influence on the souls of earthly man. In other words, the polarity of the human spirit in the form of the macrocosm and the microcosm is nothing but the polarity of these two rays of the divine essence. As a person improves and his cosmic consciousness increases, he becomes more and more connected with his ear in full harmony with this process, and thus becomes able to consciously perceive their effort on the embodied soul and even strengthen their influence by active influences. Every development of cosmic consciousness proceeds simultaneously and harmoniously, both along the vertical trajectory of the descent of the spark of the human spirit and along the horizontals lying in the various planes of the universe. We can summarize the doctrine of the ear of the various worlds in the following words. The spark of the human spirit, gradually and consistently revealed from itself one shell after another, and thus opened up to itself the possibility of descending from one plane to another, and finally reaching material existence. In each of these worlds there remained a sealed form, having its own cross-section of the ray emanating from the divine essence. And therefore these sealed images are fully spiritualized and vital beings. The soul of man is of the earth, i.e., what is bound by the bonds of matter is only a part of his whole soul, but at the same time in these fetters is also part of all the higher planes, as if captured by the immortal spark during its involution. This is rather wonderful because it means that despite the trauma of the fall in the whole of the psyche of humanity and of individuals, this tells us that at each stage in this process there was something sacred that will never be lost, which is sealed for us, the 7 seals. So when we embark upon our path of return and we manage to reascend back through these levels using the ear centres or the Laya Centre by which it was channeled down, as we reach successive layers we will be able to access and reopen our seals, which will then give the energy necessary to move again. So we always have this safeguard, our divine spark within the seals. And most people understand this process, I suppose, with the analogy of the chakra system moving up. Even though you go up and down, you go up and down the chakras, the idea is to raise the energy back up. And then the chakras are the seals. So, from the Zohar, when God created the world, he established 7 heavens above us and formed an equal number of lands, worlds under our feet. For just as each of these heavens has its own constellations and is filled with angels of its own particular breed, so it is on the earth below. Placed one above the other, they are all inhabited, but by beings of different natures, as has been said concerning the heavens. The essence of the whole person is interpreted in the tradition by the following symbol, which bears the name of the great square pentacle. Hang on. The square is divided into 7 columns and 7 horizontal bars. The horizontal stripes are the worlds: Adi, Anupadaka, Atma, Buddhi, Manas, Karma, and Stula. Stula? Sorry if I'm saying those wrong. These Hindi names in Kabbalah correspond to the Yeshida, the supreme union of the soul with God. Okay. The first column is the Atman ray, and for each individual band, the columns starting from the first will characterize the same 7 worlds. Each horizontal stripe is a human being, peculiar to the plane to which the stripe belongs. So in the Stula band, all 7 planes; in the Karma band, all except Stula; in the Manas band, all except Karma and Stula, etc. The last of these horizontal lines defines the type of consciousness, that is, the ego that is conscious on this plane. In all the worlds, these conscious egos are the cross-section of this plane, common to all the planes of the Atman ray, i.e. they will always be the first column. The consciousness of the Atman that lies beyond this square is the divine soul of man. On this pentacle we can trace everything that happens to a person and his consciousness under various conditions and circumstances. First of all, we can see that a person is attached to each individual plan by the last member of the horizontal row, individual plane. In other words, the more a person is able to paralyze his influence, the more he becomes like a higher being lying behind him. So again, from Sam Robinson's explanation of Mailander's teachings, we were given another mantra, as well as the Holy Spirit must birth it, I cannot will it. The next section is, I must decrease so he can increase. Yeah. The more a person is able to paralyze his influence, the more he becomes like a higher being lying behind him. I must decrease so he can increase. The incarnate person has 7 planes. He can feel the vibrations in all the columns, but at the same time he can never perceive them in a pure form and learns by analogy. During complete exteriorization, a person can fully identify with the essence of his perceptions of a 6-planed person, but he must always transfer everything he perceives into the consciousness of the physical world. That is why he can never merge with Ea until he has finally left the physical plane. The movement of the human being is the movement of his consciousness, and therefore consciousness is a cross-section of the ray of the world above, taken in time. Yay, we made it. Okay, that's not the end of that arcanum. that goes on quite a while, but I think that's a good place to stop and try and digest the enormity of what he's saying here, and just again those bits I'm talking about, Mailander teaching. This is from Sam Robinson's book, which is a completely separate publication to Shmakov, and actually a separate school. However, the impulse is always to synthesize the best of occult teachings and to show how they weave a matrix together, and our understanding of one deepens our understanding of another in this great philosophical machine. Now, I'm just wondering if, now I've said that, there is another saying from here which might be given to us. I'm sort of been experimenting with this. Well, I opened this actually at a different, Sam has, as well as given his own history of Mailander, he's also translated some of the aphorisms and works of Mailander himself, and those are in different sections. The one I gave previously, purity is innocence, only one who can sacrifice himself lives in purity. Yeah, that was at the end of the form teachings, I believe. I think. Some might be able to correct me. And anyway, this was the page I opened up just now. And at the top of this is the word anointing. You will attract inner forces of redemption. The Mem key.